Good morning, everyone, and happy almost middle of June already. I'm curious how everyone's gardening season is going so far this year. Did you get everything planted on time, maybe even early? Or are you like me and the theme of the season this year seems to be running behind no matter what you do? Now, when it comes to gardening, I have what I consider an ideal planting time, which I've covered at length on this series of videos, which covers what I plant month by month here in my Ohio garden. But then I also have what I consider my life happens planting schedule. And some of you may be able to relate to this. So it could be a vacation, an illness, an injury, a weather catastrophe. There are thousands of reasons that we may not get our gardens planted on time. But the nice thing about Ohio and other similar growing regions is that we've got a nice long frost-free window. So my average last spring frost date is usually around mid-May. This year it was like the second week of April, which made me feel even further behind than normal. Usually about May 10th, May 15th though. And then my first fall frost date is around October 15th. So on average, I've got over 150 days of a frost-free window. So what that ultimately means is that even if I don't get some of my warm season or frost tender crops in the ground the minute after that last spring frost date, I've still got some wiggle room to get plants in later. If you're watching this trying to figure out which you still have the opportunity to plant this summer, just use those frost dates as a loose reference and adjust your timing accordingly. But let's jump right into what I've just recently got into the ground here in Ohio and what I am still working on planting in the month of June. The biggest planting that I recently tackled were all of my cucurbit crops. So this row is entirely made up of melons, summer squash, and zucchini, and I just got these in the ground a few days ago. I also just finished up planting my cucumbers, pumpkins, watermelon, gourds, and butternut squash. All of these were transplants started in mid-May. I'm also still planning on direct sowing a few of my winter squash varieties. I'll be cutting it close, but these are all 110 day varieties. So I should be okay unless we get that freak frost in the middle of September this year, which with the way things are going wouldn't surprise me a bit. The nice thing about crops like summer squash or zucchini and cucumbers is that they tend to be in that 50 to 60 day maturity range, which makes them great candidates for staggered or succession plantings throughout the summer. I like to do a second planting of these crops around mid-July. I find that this timing gives me a nice flush of fruit before that fall frost comes, and I'm getting a fresh flush when my earlier planted zucchini and cucumbers are starting to peter out. And these are easy to plant either by starting seed indoors and transplanting or direct sowing. A really handy free tool for figuring out planting dates for these crops and others is offered by Johnny Seed. Check out their target harvest date calculator. I'll link it in the video description below. This is a downloadable Excel spreadsheet in which you can select your target harvest date, add the variety you're growing, the days to maturity, and then you can tweak variables such as a spring-fall factor. This is useful if you're pushing the boundaries of the season. So I add in some extra time for crops that I'm planning on harvesting very near to my fall frost date. You can tweak this column for those crops which take a little more time to ramp up to full production. I'd consider things like bush beans, zucchini, tomatoes in this group, but maybe not something like winter squash that kind of matures all at the same time. I don't use this column, but if you sell at, say, a farmer's market, for instance, and you know you want to harvest 3 days before market day, you can plug that in here. And this column is for things that we typically start from seed indoors instead of direct sowing. For example, my tomatoes spend about 30 days indoors before I transplant, so I'd plug that in here. Related to this, keep in mind that the days to maturity figure that seed catalogs and seed packets list is going to give you days to maturity from direct sowing for crops that are traditionally direct sown. Think beans, corn, lettuce, melons, etc. That number you see here is from the time you plant the seed till the projected harvest under optimal conditions. For crops that are traditionally started indoors and transplanted, i.e. tomatoes, peppers, broccoli, the days to maturity shown is from transplant, not from sowing. So you need to figure an extra 4 to 8 weeks, depending on the crop, into that total days to maturity time, which is what this days in the greenhouse column on the spreadsheet allows for. So according to Johnny's spreadsheet, I can actually sow cucumbers and zucchinis clear up until August 1st. So I may try that this year. I'm still in the process of getting all of my warm season nightshades in the ground as well. These tomatoes went in at the end of May, but I've got several big plantings at my parents' which have gone in over the course of the last week and a half. And I continue to stick plants in whenever and wherever I find the space or time. I just stuck some extra tomato and pepper seedlings in my straw bales back here. And these seedlings, which are part of my seedling fertilizer test, will be ready for transplant in about 2 weeks. That still gives them plenty of time to mature, but I find that the later into the season I transplant tomatoes, the more I do have to battle disease. Likewise, my peppers and eggplants have been on a staggered planting schedule as well. These are crops that I typically aim for getting in the ground the last 2 weeks of May. But this year, just out of necessity, I am planting them whenever I find the time. This section behind me was transplanted at the end of May, but some of my other seedlings, here, and here, and here, despite my multiple defense mechanisms, something still nibbled these, were just transplanted this week. Unfortunately, I lost the battle to the flea beetles on these earlier transplanted eggplants, so I'm trying again up here, making sure to securely cover these with insect netting the minute I got them transplanted last week. I found that with eggplant, as long as I can get them established, they manage to shake off the flea beetle damage and go on to produce a lovely crop. But if the flea beetles get them while they're still in the young seedling stage, sometimes the stress is just too much and they never recovered. Last year, I relied on coating the plants with surround kale and clay, but I wasn't on top of it this year, and this is the result. With these nightshade crops, I find that peppers and eggplants tend to take more time from seed. If you're able to find some discount seedlings from the garden center late in the season, you can still plant them up until the middle of July and potentially get a fall crop. Tomatoes and tomatillos tend to be a lot more precocious. I've not direct seeded them, but I have a gardening friend who says he's direct seeded until July 1st and still gotten a crop off of tomatoes. Again, not something I've tried, but it's worth a shot if you have some extra tomato seed lying around. I have transplanted tomatoes up until the middle of July and still gotten a nice crop. And again, the disease pressure can be a much bigger issue on those later plantings, but I was getting tomatoes from mid-September up until the frost. Beans of all sorts are still being direct sown here in my garden. I did get this planting of bush beans and my edamame in the ground at the end of May. But this row of vaquitas grex shell beans were just direct sown a few days ago, and I have more shell beans and snap beans which I've yet to plant. Like my summer squash, I have great results planting beans deep into the summer. Bush snap beans usually mature in about 50 days, so I like to aim for doing my last planting around mid-July, though some years I can get away with an early August planting. In order for shell beans to mature fully and dry, they typically need around 95 days, but mid to late June plantings still allow plenty of time, and you've got even more wiggle room if you plan to harvest them green. There's a few random odds and ends here too. I just transplanted these red foliated white cotton seedlings and these dwarf sunflowers, and I'm still working on getting all of my basil seedlings transplanted. Something else I like to work on this time of year is filling in all those empty spaces around my vegetable plantings with flowers. I still have zinnia and marigold transplants that I'm trying to get in, but at this point in the season, they could just as easily be direct sown. A few other options for easy direct sow color, fragrance, and in some cases food for pollinators that can be put in any time in June include cosmos, sunflowers, especially the smaller, earlier flowering varieties, red flowered buckwheat, cleome, holy basil, and nicotiana. Another heat-loving crop, I finally bit the bullet and put my sweet potato slips out. I went ahead and planted these in conditioned straw bales. Fingers crossed that the voles and other critters leave these alone. Sweet potatoes are typically between 90 to 110 days. Some of the Japanese purple varieties can take even longer. But if you're in a similar growing area to Ohio, sweet potatoes really don't start to take off and put on a lot of growth till it's nice and warm. So even on years when I'm not running behind, I often don't plant until the beginning of June. Now, sweet potatoes will continue to grow and develop right up until that first hard frost. With a late planting, as long as you keep them well watered, there's definitely the possibility of getting tubers. They may not be as enormous as the ones that you put in early in the season, but I think it's still worth a shot. This sweet corn was direct sown on May 29th, but the plot of flower and dent corn at my folks' place, I just got planted in the last week and a half. I keep debating about tilling up another plot back here and just throwing some more mid to early season sweet corn in there. Don't tell my husband, I promised I would not add any more gardens, but sweet corn is so easy. And even a really good mid-season corn only takes about 75 days to mature. With recent advances in breeding, there are some super early varieties, so 68-day variety corns that have exceptional eating quality as well. So I could easily put one of those in still almost to the beginning of July and get a harvest. Now, I've planted sweet corn late before. The trick I find here in our growing area is just keeping it well watered while the corn gets established. With the traditional planting time in May, here in Ohio, we typically get enough rain through the late spring that corn doesn't require any extra irrigation. But with later plantings, so that second half of June into July, I definitely have to provide some supplemental water to get those plants up and established. In addition to potentially more sweet corn, I'm also planning on sowing okra and cowpeas in the next couple of weeks. The lovely thing about these crops that are traditionally regarded as southern is that they thrive in our Ohio summers, putting up with heat, humidity, and drought once established, so they make great candidates for a little bit later sowing. So if time got away from you for whatever reason, you didn't get a summer garden planted, but you desperately still want to have a few beans or cucumbers or zucchini, never fear. There is still a good window of opportunity in many growing areas. And don't forget about the opportunity for a fall garden as well. I'll be starting many of my brassicas and other fall crops indoors in mid-July here in Ohio. For more detail on that planting schedule, check out this video. I wanted to mention too that there are a few advantages and disadvantages, maybe some challenges to getting things into the ground a little bit later than we normally would, but there are some pretty easy workarounds to ensuring that we have success with later plantings. I will be covering those in the next video, so be sure to subscribe if you're interested in hearing about that. In the meantime, I've got a lot of warm season crops to still get into the ground, so I'm going to get planting. But thanks for watching, everyone, and I will see you next time.